Right, so to understand Richard III, you have to go all the way back 150 years to his great, whatever it is, grandfather, Edward III. Edward III had many children, but the ones that are important that we need to remember are Edward, the Black Prince, famous for his black armour, William of Hatfield, famous for dying without an issue, Lionel, famous for being the third son, and John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Now, Edward the Black Prince should have become king, but while he was campaigning for his father in France, he got dysentery and then dropsy. He became so bloated that he couldn't mount his horse. He had to fight his battles on a stretcher. And then he died. And when Edward III died, his grandson, Richard II, became king. At the age of 10, Richard II was very fond of his favourites, and he wasted a vast amount of wealth on a coterie of young men, even pawning the crown jewels into the process. And then one day, very rashly, he banished his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, and he seized all of his lands and wealth. Henry responded with a successful coup, and Richard was so unpopular that many of the lords followed Henry's cause, and eventually Henry Bolingbroke deposed Richard II, and he became king, Henry IV. But he didn't much like being king. Then little low lie down, uneasy is the head that wears a crown, he was fond of saying. And when he died, his son, Henry V, became king. Well, he wasn't named Henry V, he was called Henry, and then when he became king, he was called Henry V. And he's fond of saying, once more under the breach, dear friends, once more. Remember him? Yes. Good. And then when he died, relatively young, his 9-month-old baby, Henry, became Henry VI. Now, 9 months old don't make very good kings, and so the country was eventually turned into a civil war. A lot of squabbling. We call it the Wars of the Roses, because the House of Lancaster over here was represented by the Red Rose, and the House of York here, the descendants of Lionel, the third son, they were represented by the White Rose. Richard, Duke of York, had many sons. Well, he had 4 sons. Their names are Edward, George, and over here, Richard, which is our guy that ended up in a parking lot in Leicester. And then over here, Gary. No, his name's not really Gary. It's Rutland. They call him Rutland in the play. I don't know what his first name was. He was the Earl of Rutland. Anyway, so these are the 2 houses that were fighting the Wars of the Roses, the Yorks and the Lancasters, and they went to and fro over many years. And Henry, who married Queen Margaret, who we meet in Richard III, Margaret, they had a son called Edward. And on the battlefield, Richard kills Edward. And eventually, at the end of the play, Henry VI, Richard kills Henry VI. And then we get into Richard III. And those 2 princes in the tower, their names are Edward and Richard. Edward, when Henry VI dies, becomes Edward IV. Then Richard starts plotting. Fortunately, his brother was very fond of his food, got very fat and died. So, his son should have become king, but somehow they got squirreled away in the tower and no one ever saw them again. Richard plotted to have his brother murdered. His name's Clarence. Let's backtrack a little bit. Rutland was killed by Queen Margaret in the Wars of the Roses, so he's out of the picture. So eventually, we just end up with our guy, Richard III, because there's no one else who could be king.